Well, hello and welcome back to the Dinebrary. That's what I call the dining room in our house that I've turned into a library. I'm going to be talking today, I want to teach about the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism, but I want to do it in such a way that I introduce you to another teacher, a brilliant teacher by the name of Roger Olson, excellent writer, teacher, author, professor. He's an Arminian, and he talks about this. He's at a church. He's actually at City Hill Church. He's having a discussion, and somebody is asking him these questions. Now, first of all, well, who is Roger Olson? Well, Roger Olson is, and I'll read this aloud to you. Roger Olson was born in 1952. He's an evangelical Arminian, and he's professor of theology at George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. He's been on that faculty since 1999, and he specializes in historical theology. So that's where I want to leave that. I'll show you a couple of his books that I have and that I would suggest that you get. Arminian Theology, Myths and Realities. And then the other one, which got a little more attention because of the name, is called Against Calvinism. These are both by Roger Olson. Now, in this discussion, first of all, why am I having this teaching? Why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing this because Salvation Army officers, soldiers, adherents, friends, people who worship with the Salvation Army, and other Wesleyan-Arminians are not as prolific in our understanding, in our reading, and our learning, and our ability to articulate our theology as are our Reformed brothers and sisters and our Calvinist brothers and sisters, which are often put together like they're synonyms, but they're not necessarily. But we just don't tend to know our faith very well, and that's shown not just by us. We're not just bad people or lazy people. We don't have a whole lot to go to. So there aren't as many writers, there aren't as many authors, there aren't as many teachers, there aren't as many well-known orators that have to do with Wesleyan-Arminianism. So because of that, what I want to do is share some resources with you. But one of those resources that I want to share with you is just my intro. I'm going to show you some books later, but right here what I want to do is introduce you to Roger Olson. Now, he's going to be asked a question, and then he's going to answer that question. And right here as we start, he's going to be, he's going to be talking in this first video, he's going to be explaining the difference between Arminianism and Calvinism.
As well. So in short, can you just explain Calvinism and then also explain Arminianism?
Only by first saying that what I'm going to say, are very general descriptions. So there are many differences among Calvinists. So I'm just going to give kind of a general portrait of what most Calvinists agree on, but say, well, but there are differences among them on the details. So about 100 years ago, and I don't know who it was, I'd like to know his name, but some professor of theology came up with the acronym TULIP, which is very convenient because, of course, tulips are famous for, or Holland is famous for tulips, and Holland is where a lot of Calvinism comes from. It's a hotbed of Calvinism. So TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, is just one way of remembering the main points of Calvinism, the main distinctive points of Calvinism. Now, I have to say, though, that when you talk to people in confessionally Reformed churches, like the Christian Reformed Church, they like to say, that's not us, you know. That's just a little tiny part of what we believe. There's much more to it. Oh, absolutely, I know that. But we're trying to focus on the main differences here. So T is total depravity. All Calvinists believe that human beings are fallen into sin and are unable to do anything that is pleasing to God without God's supernatural help. So we cannot in any way reach out to God on our own or come to God in salvation without his calling us, without his drawing us to himself and giving us the power and the ability to do that. That's one point that Calvinists and real Arminians agree on. Now, one of the things I hear all the time is, oh, you Arminians don't believe in total depravity, and the Bible says we're dead in trespasses and sins. No, we do agree on T. T is a point of agreement between Calvinists and Arminians. U is unconditional election. Are they up there? Okay, unconditional election, which in Calvinism, and again, there are different interpretations, but Calvinists believe traditionally that if a person is saved, if a person has a right relationship with God, that person was chosen by God before he or she was even born. So that person is selected by God out of the mass of fallen humanity to be saved, and it's unconditional. It's not on account of anything God saw in the person. So God wasn't attracted to the individual because he saw some goodwill toward himself in that person. He simply chose them, and that's all we can say about it. There's nothing in the person. So limited atonement is the idea that Christ died only for those that he selected to be saved. And many Calvinists have other terms they prefer than these, such as limited atonement would be particular atonement. Most Calvinists would say particular people are died for by Christ. It's not that the value of Christ's atoning death is limited, it's that it's intended only for the elect. And then I is irresistible grace, and many Calvinists would say we prefer the term effectual grace. Indeed, they do. But the TULIP acronym doesn't have E in it anywhere, so we stick with I. Irresistible grace is the idea that if you are one of God's elect, God draws you to himself irresistibly and gives you the gift of faith, and then you convert. So faith comes first, regeneration, you're born again, then faith is a gift of God, and then you convert to Christ because you're already born again. So regeneration precedes conversion. P is perseverance of the saints, which is popularly called eternal security, or the idea that if you are really one of God's elect and saved by his grace, you cannot fall away. You will not lose that salvation. Many Baptists believe in T and P, but not the U, the L, and the I, so they call themselves sometimes two-point Calvinists, which I would prefer to just say they're Arminians, who believe in perseverance.
So Arminianism, what is...
Yeah, and this is where, this is my main point that I try to get across to people is not totally different on this.
All right, so why am I interrupting? Well, I'm interrupting just now because I want you to pay attention to this if you are a Salvationist, if you are like a Wesleyan, a Methodist, United Methodist. This is our faith. So he's about to describe now what it is that we believe. And as Arminians, we're often called Pelagians. I mentioned that in the last video, or semi-Pelagians. I may give you those simple definitions from Grenz and his fellow writers or editors from his little book in a little bit. But right now, what I want us to do is really pay attention here, because this is what we, as Salvationists specifically, the Salvation Army and other Wesleyans and Holiness movement folks, this is what we believe. So I'm going to let him continue.
There's commonality, there's common ground between real Arminians and real Calvinists. But the problem is that, at least to me, as an Arminian, when I listen to Calvinists talk about Arminianism, they always get it wrong, in my opinion. And so I shoot off an email, or I put something on my blog. Now they got it wrong again. So let's go over Arminianism. Okay. Arminians agree. Real Arminians, Arminius, Wesley, real Arminians agree that we are totally depraved. That because of Adam and Eve's sin and our inherited corruption from them, we are so damaged by sin that we cannot even lift a little finger to exercise a goodwill toward God. We cannot do anything on our own. We are dead in trespasses and sins. But Arminians believe that God gives prevenient grace through the Word, through the communication of the gospel. He works prevenient grace in the heart of hearers so that they are able, for the first time, because of his supernatural grace, to make a decision for or against Christ. So it's freed will, not free will. When people say, I believe in free will, I say, yeah, I believe in free will to choose this brand of pizza or that brand of pizza. But when it comes to spiritual matters, I do not believe in free will. I believe in freed will. So prevenient grace is a key doctrine of Arminianism, but many Calvinists would say, well, we believe in prevenient grace too. Yes, but here's the difference. For a Calvinist, prevenient grace is irresistible for the elect. and does no good for the non-elect. For an Arminian, anyone who comes within the sound or under the influence of the gospel receives some measure of prevenient grace and is enabled to respond positively to the gospel.
Okay, so here what I want to say is this. The difference is that prevenient grace, and he may have already said this, but I'm thinking, so I may not have heard him. But what I want us to understand here is that prevenient grace comes before all people. All people, every person is given the call of God, especially through hearing the gospel. The Holy Spirit also is prodding us and calling us to Him. But the difference between the reason why the Calvinists and Reform see this differently, and I want to say this as graciously as possible because they're not our enemies, they're not my enemies, is that they don't see prevenient grace this way because they believe they believe that people are called from even before the time that they're elected, before Adam and Eve ever even showed up on the scene, that people who are saved are elected unconditionally, and that God has just chosen them, and apparently our Reformed and Calvinist brothers and sisters don't like the word arbitrarily, but God chooses arbitrarily who's going to be given eternal salvation and who's going to be given eternal reprobation. So, but for the Arminians, we believe that God's pouring out His prevenient grace, which means the grace that is enabling grace, assisting grace, that He is giving that to every person, and that we're not just arbitrarily chosen. So I wanted to add that.
And accept God's grace and mercy. Without that prevenient grace, they would never be able to do that. So really, there's more common ground there, at least from kind of a bird's eye view, but when you get closer down to it, there's a difference over whether it's resistible or not. Arminians believe grace is always resistible. Arminians believe that election is both unconditional and conditional. So we believe that unconditional election means God chooses to have a people. He chose.
Okay, before he goes on, and then we'll let him do this part, but resistible grace, what does that mean? Well, it means that you can choose to respond, to appropriate God's grace, and to respond and follow Christ, or you can choose not to. We're not puppets, we're not robots, we're not anything that God is pulling around and making us do what God wants us to do. And that's because He did free our will. He's freed our will so that we can choose to follow Him or not, because He's a God of love. He's not a dictator. So anyway, let's let Roger go on.
He chose to have Israel. He chose to have a church. That's unconditional. But who is in it is conditional. And so God determines that there will be a people for His name and invites us in. Now, if we respond to God's prevenient grace, to His invitation, to His calling, then we become part of God's elect people. Predestination is that God knows who is going to do that. God's foreknowledge. Romans 8, for those whom He foreknew, He did predestinate to be conformed to the image of His Son. So we base predestination on foreknowledge. And then limited atonement. Arminians believe that Christ died equally for all people, that nobody is left out of Christ's atonement. Christ suffered the penalty for sin for all people. And then resistible grace, we believe it's always resistible, so we don't believe in irresistible grace. Arminians don't. We believe that God puts pressure on people, but He doesn't leave us without a choice. He doesn't coerce us or draw us irresistibly or bend our wills, as Calvinists often say. He draws, but He doesn't coerce or overwhelm. He leaves us with the ability to say no. And then perseverance is a matter that Arminians disagree on. Arminius himself said that he didn't really know what the Bible said about that it would take many more years of study, and he died before he came to any definite conclusion. Wesley believed that you can lose your salvation, but many Arminians believe and I would say this is the majority of Baptists, in my experience, believe that you cannot lose your salvation, but that becoming saved in the first place involves freed will.
Okay. Now that's him explaining. Well, let me put myself back on here so you can see me. This has been Roger Olson explaining the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism. Now, in this second video, what we're going to look at is Roger Olson now is going to be teaching us a little bit about who the authors are, who the teachers are, who are the people that talk about this, and who is influencing those of us who are either Calvinistic or Arminianistic, I guess that's a word, in our theology, and so I want him to share this with us as well.
Just a question for you. What are some famous historical and today's leaders for Calvinism and then for Arminianism?
Well, I think we all know certain names for Calvinism. John Piper is extremely influential, and he has pastors who look to him and are very much influenced by him. You mentioned some of them. Others would be Louis Giglio and Matt Chandler and, yes, Mark Driscoll here. Not to say that they agree with everything he teaches. They're not, like little followers or something, but they're influenced by him. So I would say the most influential Calvinist today, in terms of numbers, people influenced by him through his writings, is John Piper. But another important one is Mike Horton. I mentioned him. He's written many books and edits Modern Reformation magazine, which I've written for, believe it or not. He invited me to write an article about Joel Osteen and New Thought for Modern Reformation. But of course, he had to put a little disclaimer at the top. We don't agree with Roger Olson about many things, but on this issue we agree. So he's one. And, we could go on listing and naming them, but there just
What
been
about
so
historical
many.
figures?
Oh, in the past, since Calvin. Well, the interesting thing is we call it Calvinism, but if you go back to Augustine in the 5th century, he was already saying many of the things that we think of as Calvinism. Toward the end of his life, he wrote 2 treatises called On the Predestination of the Saints, and when you read that one, and then the second one is On the Perseverance of the Saints, you go, wait a minute, I call this Calvinism, Not to say they're identical, but they're very much influential on Calvin himself, and Calvin admitted that he was really just saying much the same that Augustine had said, but he thought it had been forgotten by the Catholic Church, and so he was resurrecting Augustine's teaching on the predestination of the saints. And of course, after Calvin, there have been many. I think a lot of what goes under the label Calvinism today is really more birthed by Calvin's successor in Geneva, Theodore Beza, who was a scholastic Protestant thinker who tried to take Calvinism and put it in a really tight, logical system. And of course, after Beza, there would be people like John Knox, the reformer of Scotland, who was the founder of the Presbyterian tradition, Charles Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher of the 19th century, William Carey, the great father of modern missions. So where do you want me to stop?
What about
we could go on
Arminianism?
forever.
Because Calvinist leaders are Whitfield and others, but what about Arminianism?
Oh, not many, unfortunately. Not as well known, anyway. John Wesley, of course. And in the 19th century, we have lesser-known people in the Methodist tradition, for example. William Burton Pope was a great Methodist theologian in the 19th century that I studied and read a lot for my book on Arminian theology. Some of the great revivalists of the 19th century. I personally think D.L. Moody was more of an Arminian than a Calvinist, though some people might argue with me about that. I like to count Billy Graham as an Arminian, hopefully, anyway. And I don't know whether he'd call himself that. Today, Thomas Oden, a very profound Methodist thinker and evangelical, who's written, by the way, the classic book on Arminian soteriology, which is the doctrine of salvation, the transforming power of grace. I always recommend when people ask me, what's the best book on Arminian theology about salvation? That's it, Thomas Oden, The Transforming Power of Grace. Clark Pinnock, Greg Boyd, can go on and on. I would say Scott McKnight, but I hate to label people because a lot of them don't like the label Arminian because it's been...
So in here, This is now where we're going to get into him telling us who the different denominations are, which denominations are Calvinistic, Reformed, and which ones are Wesleyan-Arminian. And so this is a much shorter video. It only lasts for about a minute, and then I'm going to disrupt it and talk a little bit about the Salvation Army and some other things. Okay?
Denominations-wise, which denominations lean Calvinist and which denominations lean more Arminian?
Yeah, well, among Calvinists, of course, there'd be the Christian Reformed Church, Presbyterian Church of America, almost any church with Reformed in its name. There are a lot of Baptist churches, not so much denominations, but individual churches and networks of churches that are very Calvinistic. Many congregational churches are Calvinistic. Arminian, the Nazarene, the offshoots of Methodism, holiness churches, Wesleyan, Methodist, and things like that, and historically, Pentecostals. I've been a student of Pentecostal history, and I've written much about it. I have an article in the current issue of NUMA, the Journal of the Society for Pentecostal Studies. And Pentecostalism is historically Arminian. There's no question about that. No one could debate me on that. But what's happening now is, through the influence of John Piper and others, Calvinism is beginning to creep and seep into places where it's never been before. And that's really troubling a lot of Pentecostal leaders.
Okay, so that's where I want to end his discussions. Now, here's what I wanted to bring up. I want to talk about Horton, Michael Horton, great writer, excellent writer, very Calvinist. And this is his teaching. Let me get over here so I can just talk to you. Anyway, in his book, I actually cite his book in my dissertation. And here's what Michael Horton says. It's according to Michael Horton, Wesleyan-Arminian theology, the theology to which the Salvation Army subscribes, includes a semi-Pelagian belief that salvation requires some human participation and effort in cooperation with God's saving work. Now, John Wesley himself actually refuted this, and he's quoted in Kenneth Collins' book, and I want to show you that book. So if you want, you can get this book. Let's see that there it is. Let me show you. So this is Kenneth Collins' book, and in this book he quotes John Wesley, and Collins says, in quoting Wesley, he says, some sinners, he argues that against what Horton is saying, that we're semi-Pelagian, that some sinners will be lost simply because, as Wesley puts it, they will not be saved. In other words, they stubbornly refuse what grace is offered. They will not come to the Savior so that they may have life. Now, that again was Michael Horton's book here. The Salvation Army and our Wesleyan-Arminianism, we don't believe that we save ourselves. But I want to show you, I just want to read a couple of definitions here because I want you to understand that what we're being accused of. And so these are just very short definitions. There's Pelagianism, and then there's semi-Pelagianism. So Pelagianism is the teaching of a British monk, Pelagius. I mentioned this in my last video. He supposedly declared that human effort and merit could bring about salvation without divine grace. And I love what the Stanley Grenz and his other authors here. There's two of them. There's two more. Stanley Grenz, David Goretzky, and then Cherith Fee Nordling. But Stanley Grenz is well known. He's a very prolific writer. And he's not a Calvinist, by the way. But I like it that he said supposedly declared. Why does he say that Pelagius supposedly declared that human effort and merit could bring about salvation without divine grace? Because that's what Pelagius was accused of, but it wasn't what he said. He doesn't actually teach that you don't need grace or that you don't need God's help. He didn't teach that at all. But because he was arguing against the great Augustine and the great Jerome of his time back in the 4th century, I mean, they just took him to school, and accused him of being a heretic. And then he died at the age of 49, unable to really defend himself fully, and it kind of stuck. So Pelagian became the boogeyman for Arminianism, that they say that we're Pelagian, where we think that we don't need God's help for salvation, or we're semi-Pelagian, and I'll give you the definition of semi-Pelagianism. That's also in this book. Let me just find it. Semi-Pelagianism. Where are you? There it is. It's a word that later came to be used to describe the doctrines proposed between AD 427 and 529, which theologically held a middle ground between Pelagius and Augustine. Semi-Pelagians maintain that faith begins independently of God's grace. So they still say that you don't need God's grace, although such grace is subsequently necessary for salvation. Okay? So you don't need grace for faith, but you need grace for salvation. And that predestination is simply divine foreknowledge. So neither of those are what Arminians believe, and yet it's what we're accused of. Okay? Now, let's keep going, because Michael Horton he accuses those of us without a strong Calvinistic belief or a strong Reformed belief of being of expressing a Christless Christianity, which there's another author here. He's the guy who did the research on the National Study of Youth and Religion, and I'm in my dining room, so you probably hear the door open and close. I apologize for that. Soul Searching. And this is the Soul Searching, the Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers, Christian Smith with Melinda Lundquist Denton. And he did the National Study of Youth and Religion. And he found out that the vast majority of religious people in the West, and mostly, we're just going to talk about the United States, but Western faith is filled with moralistic therapeutic deism. And what is that? Well, I'm going to actually show you a little bit about that. Because this is the Christless Christianity that many people, about as many as 70% of churchgoers and of all religions, are moralistic therapeutic deists. And so I'm going to show you this document. This document actually is from my dissertation, and this defines moralistic therapeutic deism. So let me read that for you. First, these are the beliefs, the 5 beliefs. A God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. Second, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And 5, good people go to heaven when they die. This probably defines a lot of people that we know. It may even define you. And here's the moralistic therapeutic deism in a nutshell. Moralistic. You think that faith is to make you into, or turn you into, or teach you how to be a good boy or girl. It's why a lot of people stop going to church when they become late teenagers or adults. Well, I learned how to be a good boy or girl. I can leave now. So when do they come back to church? When they have kids that they need to teach how to be good boys and girls. Moralistic, right? Therapeutic. It's there to make me feel good. It's why people say, well, I stopped going to that church because I wasn't being fed. Really what it meant was they didn't make me feel good. I didn't leave with a good feeling. I didn't feel happy when I was there. So it's therapeutic. Our faith is to make us happy. And then finally, it's deistic, which means God created everything, but he stays out of the way until I need him. He's like my cosmic paramedic or my cosmic butler. So when I need God, I just clap my hands and the genie shows up. And that's the deistic part of most of our faith. So I want to leave it with that, except the last thing that I want to show you is I just want to give you a couple more resources. And the reason why I want to give you a couple more resources is because if you want to go on and read on your own, well, then of course I want you to do that. So I'm going to show you a couple of resources. I'm going to go back first of all and show you this one. This is, if you want a systematic theology on Wesleyan-Arminianism, Thomas Oden, the best. He's the top, right? I have this book. It's phenomenal. So that's one of them. The other one that I want to show you and is his book, which Thomas Oden says is the best one on understanding Arminianism. This is also by Oden, The Transforming Power of Grace. And then, again, I want to recommend to you Gordon T. Smith's Called to Be Saints. I don't get anything for showing you these books. This is just to teach you. This is, if you want to know more about your faith as a Wesleyan Arminian, these are the books you should be reading. Okay, so this is from Gordon Smith. He's also another great writer. And then again, back to Kenneth Collins, The Theology of John Wesley. Now, I'm going to show you, I'm going to have to step away here from the camera just for a second because I want to grab a series of books and I want to show you this series of books. So over here on my bookshelf, let me just grab that. That's kind of noisy when I fell down or plopped down on that seat. Here's another book by Thomas Oden, Pastoral Theology. So that's a great book as well. And then this is a series. My other one is in my stack of books that I was using to study over there, so I don't have it right with me. But there are actually 4 of these. These are by Thomas Oden. So Thomas Oden did a lot of writing. He's now gone, unfortunately. But this is a whole series on John Wesley. So again, there are 4 of these. I have 3 right here, but I actually have all 4 of them. And so if you want to read, for example, about John Wesley's teachings, pastoral theology, or ethics and society, or God and providence, and then the 4th one, I wish I could see it from here, but I can't see exactly where I laid it down. Okay, it must be it's probably on my bedside table. But anyway, those are the books that I wanted to show you. And so anyway, learn more about your faith. Get to know what you believe so that you can articulate your belief in your teaching, your preaching, other ministry, your praying, and in your discussions. God bless you. Keep the faith. Grace and peace.